The first thing everyone noticed about the Whitakers was how normal they seemed, and in a place like Houston's outer suburbs, normal wasn't just expected, it was practically a requirement. A silent contract between neatly trimmed lawns, white picket fences, and the illusion that nothing truly bad could ever happen behind closed doors. Their house stood on the quiet curve of Alderbrook Lane, where the evenings smelt faintly of cut grass and distant barbecue smoke, where children rode bikes in lazy circles and neighbors waved without really looking, and yet somehow the Whitaker home always felt just a degree too still, like a photograph where something had been carefully removed. Daniel Whitaker was the kind of man people trusted, instantly soft-spoken, a systems analyst who worked remotely, always home, always present, always smiling with a politeness that bordered on rehearsed. His wife, Elise, was quieter, her beauty understated, her expressions often unreadable, as though she were listening to something others couldn't hear. And then there was their son, Caleb, who rarely played outside, who watched the other children with a strange, studying intensity that made parents subtly call their kids back inside earlier than usual, though none of them could ever explain why. It started, as these things often do, with something small enough to ignore the disappearance of a golden retriever named Murphy belonging to the Henderson family, 3 houses down. Dogs wandered sometimes, fences broke, gates were left open, and the flyers went up on street corners with hopeful smiles and reward numbers, but Murphy was never found, and though it left a quiet sadness in the neighborhood, life resumed its rhythm, because that's what people do when discomfort knocks. They pretend not to hear it. A week later, another pet vanished, then another, each case dismissed with the same casual explanations, but patterns have a way of forming whether people acknowledge them or not, and slowly an unease settled over Alderbrook Lane like a shadow stretching longer each evening. The Whitakers, of course, remained untouched by it all. Their lawn was always perfect, their trash bins always precisely placed at the curb, their windows always closed, just a bit too tightly. And if anyone noticed that Daniel never seemed surprised by the news of missing pets, or that Elise never expressed sympathy in quite the expected way, those thoughts were quickly buried under the comforting weight of denial. Then came the smell, not constant, not overwhelming, just occasional, drifting faintly in the humid Texas air during late evenings when the wind shifted just right, a metallic, almost sweet odor that no one could quite place. Some blamed nearby construction, others a faulty sewer line, and a few simply chose not to think about it at all, because thinking about it led to questions, and questions led to places people didn't want to go. It was Mrs. Klein, the retired nurse across the street, who first allowed suspicion to take root. She had lived long enough to recognize when something didn't align, when the surface of normality concealed something darker underneath, and she noticed things others didn't. The way Daniel's car left the driveway at odd hours past midnight, the way Caleb's clothes sometimes carried faint stains that weren't quite mud, the way Elise would stand at the kitchen window late at night, unmoving, as if guarding something rather than simply watching. But suspicion without proof is a lonely burden, and when she casually mentioned her concerns during a neighborhood gathering, she was met with polite laughter and gentle dismissal, because accusing a family like the Whitakers of anything beyond being a little odd felt almost absurd. Weeks passed, and the unease deepened, fed by whispers that never fully formed into accusations. Children began inventing small myths about the Whitaker house, that the lights in the basement flickered at strange hours, that shadows moved behind curtains even when no one was home, that sometimes, very late at night, a faint scraping sound could be heard if you stood close enough to their fence. But children's stories are easily dismissed, their imaginations blamed for what adults refused to confront. The turning point came quietly, almost imperceptibly, when a young man named Trevor Mills, who lived at the far end of the street, failed to return home after an evening jog. At first, it didn't seem connected. People disappeared in cities after all. Lives intersected with randomness and tragedy every day. But Alderbrook Lane wasn't supposed to be that kind of place, and as days turned into a week with no sign of Trevor, the carefully maintained illusion of safety began to fracture. Police canvassed the area, knocking on doors, asking routine questions, their presence both reassuring and deeply unsettling. And when they reached the Whitaker house, Daniel welcomed them in with that same calm smile, answering everything with measured clarity, his composure so perfect it almost felt practiced, while Elise stood just behind him, silent, her gaze lingering a fraction too long on each officer as if memorizing them. The search yielded nothing, no evidence, no leads, no reason to suspect the quiet family on Alderbrook Lane. But sometimes the absence of evidence feels heavier than its presence, like a void waiting to be filled. That night, as the neighborhood tried once again to settle back into its routine, Mrs. Billets Pline stood at her window, watching the Whitaker house across the street, and for the first time she noticed the basement light flicker on at precisely 2:17 a.m., a detail so oddly specific it sent a chill through her. Moments later she saw Daniel step outside, dragging something heavy toward the side gate, his movements deliberate, careful, as though aware of being watched even when he shouldn't have been. And though she couldn't see what he was moving, the faint metallic smell drifted across the street once more, stronger this time, undeniable. And in that moment a thought formed in her mind so horrifying she almost rejected it outright. But once a thought like that takes root, it doesn't leave. It grows, feeding on every unanswered question, every odd detail, every uneasy feeling that had been ignored for too long. Across the neighborhood, behind locked doors and drawn curtains, others were beginning to feel it too, that something was wrong, deeply wrong, and that whatever truth lay hidden within the Whitaker home was not just disturbing, but dangerous. And inside that house, beneath the quiet facade, in a basement no one had ever seen, something waited in the darkness, something that had been carefully concealed for far too long, something that, once uncovered, would shatter not just Alderbrook Lane, but an entire nation's understanding of how well we truly know the people living right next door. Part 2. What Lies Beneath. By the time suspicion finally found its voice on Alderbrook Lane, it didn't arrive as a scream, it came as a quiet, persistent whisper that refused to be silenced, threading its way through conversations, lingering in the pauses between sentences, growing stronger each time someone mentioned Trevor Mills and the fact that he still hadn't been found. The neighborhood had changed in subtle but undeniable ways. Doors now locked a little earlier, porch lights left on through the night, curtains drawn tighter as though fabric alone could keep whatever unseen threat lurked outside at bay. And yet the Whitaker house remained exactly as it had always been. Still, orderly, untouched by the creeping anxiety that gripped everyone else, which in itself began to feel like the most unnatural thing of all. Mrs. Klein could no longer ignore what she had seen. The image of Daniel Whitaker dragging something heavy across his yard replaying in her mind with relentless clarity, and though doubt tried to soften its edges, tried to reshape it into something harmless, the smell, that sickly metallic sweetness, kept returning to anchor her fears in something disturbingly real. She told herself she needed proof, something tangible, something she could bring to the police without sounding like a paranoid old woman spinning stories from shadows. And so she began to watch more closely, her routine quietly shifting from casual observation to something bordering on obsession. Her nights no longer spent in restful sleep, but in silent vigilance by the window. It wasn't long before she noticed the pattern. The basement light flickered on at irregular intervals, always deep into the night, always for durations that seemed too long to be innocent. And occasionally, though rarely, she would see Elise descend the narrow stairs visible through a side window, carrying items wrapped in plain, unmarked bags. There was a precision to it all, a rhythm that suggested routine rather than chaos, which somehow made it far more unsettling, because routines imply intention, and intention implies purpose. Meanwhile, the official investigation into Trevor's disappearance was beginning to stall, the police forced to consider possibilities that stretched far beyond Alderbrook Lane abduction, voluntary disappearance, even the faint chance of an accident in some unsearched corner of the city. But none of those explanations sat well with Detective Aaron Vasquez, a man whose instincts had been honed by years of chasing truths that others overlooked. There was something about this neighborhood, something about the way people spoke, or rather, The way they avoided speaking, that suggested a deeper current beneath the surface, and though he couldn't yet articulate it, he felt drawn back to the Whitaker house with a quiet, persistent unease. Daniel, for his part, remained the perfect neighbor under scrutiny, cooperative to a fault, answering every question with calm precision, offering access to his home without hesitation. And it was this openness that made him so difficult to suspect, because guilt, as most people understand it, tends to hide, tends to evade, tends to crack under pressure. But Daniel did none of those things. He welcomed it, absorbed it, stood in the presence of suspicion as though it were simply another social obligation to be managed. And when Vasquez stepped into the Whitaker home for the second time, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was the one being studied, not the other way around. The house itself offered nothing, no signs of struggle, no hidden spaces easily discovered, no obvious evidence that anything sinister had ever taken place within its walls. And yet there was a weight to it, an atmosphere that felt carefully controlled, as though every object had been placed with deliberate intention, every surface cleaned, not just for appearance but for erasure. Elise moved quietly through the rooms during the visit, her presence almost ghost-like, her eyes occasionally meeting Vasquez's with a gaze that lingered just long enough to feel deliberate, as if she knew something he didn't, as if she were waiting for him to figure it out. It was Caleb, however, who unsettled him the most. The boy, standing at the edge of the living room, watching the interaction with a stillness that felt unnatural for someone his age. His expression unreadable, his attention unwavering, and when Vasquez offered him a friendly smile, the child returned it with something that looked like a smile but lacked warmth, lacking the spontaneous innocence that should have been there. Instead, it felt practiced, learned, as though he were mimicking something he had seen rather than expressing something he felt. Days passed, and the investigation seemed to circle endlessly without progress. But tension has a way of forcing movement, and eventually it was a small, almost insignificant detail that shifted everything. A report from a sanitation worker who mentioned that the Whitakers' trash bins were unusually heavy on certain collection days, heavier than what would be expected from a family of three, and though it wasn't evidence of a crime, it was enough to catch Vasquez's attention, enough to add another piece to a puzzle that was slowly beginning to take shape in his mind. He returned once more, this time with a warrant to examine the property more thoroughly, and though Daniel's smile never faltered, there was something different in his eyes now, something sharper, more alert, as though the game had reached a new stage, one where the stakes had quietly, irrevocably increased. The search began methodically, officers moving through each room with practiced efficiency, documenting, cataloging, looking for anything that might have been missed before. But once again, the house resisted, offering nothing beyond its carefully maintained facade. It was only when they turned their attention to the basement door that the atmosphere shifted, the air itself seeming to grow heavier as if in anticipation of what lay beyond. And for the briefest moment, Elise's composure cracked, not visibly, not in a way most would notice, but enough for Vasquez to see it, a flicker of something that could only be described as fear. The door opened with a quiet creak, revealing a narrow staircase descending into dim light, and as the officers made their way down, the smell returned, stronger now, unmistakable, filling the confined space with that same metallic sweetness that had haunted the neighborhood for weeks. The basement itself was larger than expected, its layout partially obscured by shelves and storage units, but what stood out immediately was how clean it was. Too clean, surfaces wiped to a near sterile shine, as though any trace of disorder had been meticulously erased. At first glance, nothing appeared out of place, but then one of the officers noticed something along the far wall, a section of flooring that didn't quite match the rest. Its surface subtly different in texture, its edges just slightly uneven, and as they moved closer, the tension in the room tightened to a breaking point. Vasquez crouched, running his hand along the seam, feeling the faintest indication that this wasn't part of the original structure, and when he looked up, his eyes met Daniel's for a brief, charged moment, the silence between them heavy with unspoken understanding. This was it, the line between suspicion and truth, the moment where everything hidden would either remain buried or finally be brought into the light. The panel was pried open slowly, each movement deliberate, controlled as though rushing would somehow make what lay beneath more real, and as the gap widened, the smell intensified, no longer faint or ambiguous, but overwhelming, undeniable, a physical force that seemed to push back against them. One of the officers stepped away, unable to contain his reaction, while another covered his mouth, eyes wide with dawning horror. What they found beneath that floor was not just evidence of a crime. It was something far worse, something that defied easy explanation, something that would ripple far beyond the boundaries of Alderbrook Lane and into the consciousness of an entire nation. And as Vasquez stared into that hidden space, the truth finally began to take shape in his mind. A truth so disturbing it reframed every detail, every disappearance, every uneasy feeling that had been dismissed as paranoia. Behind him, Daniel Whitaker stood perfectly still, his expression unchanged, his calm demeanor intact, even as the illusion he had so carefully constructed began to collapse. And in that moment, it became clear that whatever secret the Whitakers had been hiding, it was not born of desperation or impulse, but of something far more deliberate, something cultivated over time, something that suggested this was never going to end on its own. And as the officers moved to secure the scene, as the reality of what they had uncovered began to settle in, one question lingered above all others, unspoken but impossible to ignore. How long had this been happening, and how many people had already disappeared into the quiet, unassuming house at the end of Alderbrook Lane without anyone truly noticing until it was far too late? Part 3. The Truth They Fed On. The moment the hidden space beneath the Whitaker basement floor was exposed, time seemed to fracture, as though the world itself hesitated before fully accepting what had just been uncovered. The officers didn't speak at first, not because they didn't know what to say, but because language felt insufficient, fragile against the weight of what lay before them, something so deeply unnatural that the mind resisted it, even as the eyes confirmed it again and again. And Detective Aaron Vasquez, who had seen more than his share of human darkness, felt a rare and unsettling disorientation settle into his chest, the kind that comes when reality no longer behaves the way it's supposed to. The space was not large, but it was deliberate constructed, reinforced, hidden with care that spoke not of panic, but of planning, and within it were containers, tools, and remnants arranged with an order that suggested routine rather than chaos. This was not the aftermath of a single terrible act, nor even a series of impulsive ones, but something sustained, something practiced, something that had existed quietly beneath the surface of normal life for far longer than anyone in Alderbrook Lane could have imagined. And as the officers began to process the scene, the truth emerged, not all at once, but in fragments, each piece adding to a picture that grew more horrifying with every passing second. Behind them, Daniel Whitaker remained still, his calm now taking on a different quality, not the ease of innocence, but the steadiness of someone who had already accepted the outcome, as though this moment had been anticipated, perhaps even prepared for. And when Vasquez finally turned to face him, expecting denial, panic, or at least some attempt at explanation, what he found instead was something far more disturbing, a quiet, almost relieved acknowledgement, as if the burden of secrecy had finally been lifted. Elise stood nearby, her composure fractured in a way that revealed not guilt alone, but something more complex, something tangled between fear and loyalty. Her eyes no longer unreadable, but filled with a depth of emotion that suggested years of silence, years of complicity, years of living within a reality that had slowly reshaped her into someone she might not have recognized once. Caleb, however, was the most unsettling presence of all, because he did not react with shock or confusion, or even fear. He watched, the same way he had always watched, with that quiet, studying intensity, as though this moment was simply another lesson unfolding before him, another piece of knowledge being absorbed into a framework that had been built long before anyone thought to question it. The arrests were made without resistance, the procedure unfolding with clinical precision as the family was separated, escorted out of the house that had concealed their secret for so long. And for the first time, the illusion of normalcy shattered completely in the eyes of the neighborhood. Neighbors watching from behind curtains and doorways as the truth they had refused to see was carried out into the open in flashing lights and quiet, controlled chaos. News spread quickly, faster than anyone could contain, and within hours, Alderbrook Lane was no longer just another quiet suburban street in Houston. It had become the center of a story so shocking, so deeply disturbing, that it captured the attention of an entire nation, each new detail fueling a mixture of horror and disbelief that refused to settle into understanding. The investigation that followed peeled back the layers of the Whitakers' lives with relentless thoroughness, and what it revealed was not a sudden descent into darkness, but a slow, deliberate construction of it, a reality shaped over years through choices that, taken individually, might not have seemed catastrophic, but together formed something monstrous. Records were examined, timelines reconstructed, connections traced, and with each discovery, the scale of what had been hidden grew larger, more complex, more impossible to ignore. It became clear that the disappearances had not been random, nor entirely opportunistic, but guided by a logic known only to Daniel, a system that dictated who was taken and when, a pattern that made sense only when viewed through the lens of a mindset that operated far outside the boundaries of what most people could comprehend. And at the center of it all was a belief, one that Daniel would eventually articulate with chilling clarity during interrogation, a belief that reframed everything not as acts of desperation or even cruelty, but as something he had come to see as necessary, even justified. He spoke calmly, the same measured tone he had always used, explaining not just what they had done, but why, as though offering a rationale would somehow bridge the gap between his reality and that of the world now judging him. And though his words were recorded, analyzed, and dissected by experts, they never fully translated into something that could be understood in any meaningful sense, because understanding requires a shared framework of logic, and Daniel Whitaker no longer operated within one that others could recognize. Elise's account was different, fragmented, layered with hesitation and contradiction, her role emerging as both participant and prisoner of circumstance, someone who had crossed a line and then found herself unable or unwilling to return, her silence over the years becoming its own form of complicity, her choices narrowing until there seemed to be no path left but forward into darkness. Caleb's situation raised questions that proved even more difficult to answer, because he had not chosen this life in the same way, had not stepped into it as an adult with full awareness of its implications, but had been shaped by it from the beginning. His understanding of normality molded by the environment in which he was raised, and as psychologists attempted to assess him, to determine the extent of his awareness, his responsibility, his potential for rehabilitation, they were confronted with a mind that did not align neatly with any expectation, a mind that had learned to navigate a reality most people could not even imagine. As the case unfolded in the public eye, it became more than just a story of crime. It became a mirror, reflecting uncomfortable questions back at society, questions about how something like this could exist undetected for so long, about how well we truly know the people around us, about the limits of perception and the dangers of assumption, and perhaps most unsettling of all, about the thin line that separates the appearance of normalcy from the reality that may lie beneath it. Alderbrook Lane would never recover its former sense of peace. The physical traces of the Whitaker house eventually erased, replaced, rebuilt, but the memory remained, embedded in the collective consciousness of those who had lived there, a quiet reminder that what we choose not to see can sometimes be as dangerous as what we do. And long after the headlines faded, after the trials concluded and the details settled into history, the story endured, not just because of its shock value, but because of the way it lingered in the mind, a question without a comfortable answer. If something so carefully hidden could exist in a place defined by its normalcy, how many other secrets remain buried behind closed doors, waiting for the moment when the illusion finally breaks and the truth, no matter how horrifying, is forced into the light?